A stranger left an envelope on my doorstep and told me my mother's will had never been revoked. That was the whole problem. Without the original, the law didn't care what she'd wanted. It cared what could be proven, and my brother had already told the family I'd get nothing. My name's Dana, and I've spent 6 years writing witness affidavits for other people's family disasters at an elder law firm, and somehow I never once thought to keep an eye on my own. The envelope was thin. Manila softened at the corners, like it had lived in someone's coat pocket for a while. I almost didn't open the door. It was 9 at night, 11 days after the funeral, and I'd stopped expecting anyone to knock who wasn't a realtor's assistant asking about the house. "You're Eleanor's daughter," the man on my step said. Not a question. Late 70s, maybe, in a windbreaker that had seen better decades. The younger one, Dana. "Do I know you?" "Walter Pruitt," he said, like the name should mean something, and when it didn't, he softened. "I notarized your mother's will 19 years ago this September. I've been telling myself for 2 weeks I wasn't going to get involved, and then I couldn't sleep, so." He held out the envelope. "That's a photocopy, and my notary page." "The original's not in there, because I never had the original. Your mother did. But I signed my name to it, and I remember exactly what it said, and I remember exactly who else was in that room." I took it because my hands moved before my head did. "Why does this matter if it's just a copy?" "Because your brother's telling people there's no will at all." Walter zipped his jacket to the chin, already backing off my porch like he'd delivered a verdict, and didn't want to watch the sentencing. And under this state's law, if a will was last seen in the testator's possession and it can't be found after she dies, a judge presumes she destroyed it herself, presumes she revoked it. Doesn't matter what it said, doesn't matter what she wanted. Gone paper, gone will, unless somebody can prove otherwise. And you think somebody took it? "I think your mother kept that lockbox like it was a second heart," he said. "I don't think a woman like that burned her own will on a whim." He was already at the steps. "There was a second witness that day, Dana. I only remember a first name. You'll want to find her before your brother finds out you're looking." I stood in my doorway holding a photocopy of a document that legally meant nothing yet, in a state that would hand my mother's house to the person who'd already spent 2 weeks telling our whole family I wasn't getting a dime. Derek didn't need to steal from me outright. He just needed the original to disappear. I read the photocopy standing in my kitchen with the stove light on, because I didn't trust myself to turn on anything brighter. The language was plain. Eleanor Marsh Whitfield, of sound mind, leaving the house on Featherstone Road and its contents to her daughter Dana, with a modest cash bequest to her son. Dated. Signed. Notarized by Walter Pruitt. A second signature sat below his, in handwriting I didn't recognize, first name legible, last name a smear where the toner had failed. Renata. "There's no way that's enforceable," my brother said the next morning, standing in my mother's kitchen instead of his own, arms crossed over a t-shirt like he'd come straight from a gym I doubted he attended. Derek, 3 years older, the one who'd handled the funeral home while I'd handled the hospital, the one everyone still called responsible out of habit rather than evidence. "You're waving around a Xerox with no original attached, Dana. That's not a will. That's wishful thinking with a stamp on it." "I know how the presumption works, Derek. I write these affidavits for a living." Then you know it doesn't matter what some old notary remembers feeling in his gut 20 years ago. 19, I said. And he was there. Were you? That landed somewhere I didn't expect. His jaw worked once before he covered it. I was 7, Dana. I don't remember Mom's estate planning from when I was in 2nd grade. I'm not asking what you remember from being 7. I'm asking what happened to the original after she got sick. Nothing happened to it. She probably tore it up herself when she changed her mind about things. He said it too fast, the way people say a sentence they've rehearsed, rather than one they've just thought of. She loved you, sure, but she loved family peace more. You know that. Our Aunt Carol appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs, the peacemaking instinct arriving right on schedule. Nobody's fighting today, she said, like an order rather than a hope. Your mother's been gone 2 weeks. Can this wait until... It can't, I said, gentler than I felt. Not if somebody's already deciding who gets what. Derek's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and something in his face went carefully blank before he pocketed it. I have to go, he said, already moving. Take the Xerox to a lawyer if you want. See how far it gets you. He left before I could ask who'd texted him or why he'd checked the lockbox in Mom's closet twice during the reception. When everyone assumed he was looking for the burial insurance papers... The presumption of revocation is a small, cruel piece of law, and I'd explained it to a dozen grieving clients without ever imagining I'd be the one on the losing side of it. If a will was last known to be in the deceased's possession, and it can't be produced after death, courts assume she destroyed it herself, intentionally, competently, on purpose. The burden flips. Instead of Derek having to prove she'd meant to disinherit me, I'd have to prove she hadn't destroyed anything at all. You need 2 things, said Priya, the associate 2 doors down from mine at the firm, when I laid the photocopy on her desk over my lunch break and pretended it belonged to a client, corroborating evidence that the original existed and was valid at execution, which you basically have with the notary willing to testify, and something that rebuts the presumption itself, proof she didn't have access to destroy it, proof someone else did. What if there's a second witness? Would that help? It would help a lot. 2 witnesses independently confirming the same signing, same content, same date. A judge doesn't love overturning that on a hunch about revocation. She slid the photocopy back to me without asking whose client this was, which was its own kind of kindness. Find her, whoever Renata is. I didn't tell her that the man who'd handed me the photocopy had also handed me, without meaning to, a small, unbearable fact. My mother's lockbox key had been in Derek's coat pocket at the funeral reception, and I'd watched him slip it back into his own jacket, not hers. Walter Pruitt's notary practice had closed 9 years ago, but he still kept the ledgers. State law required it, he said. 7 years minimum, though he'd never had the heart to throw the older ones out. I found him in a converted garage 2 towns over, boxes of leather-bound record books, stacked like a second, smaller life. Renata, he said, running a finger down a column of names with a magnifying glass that trembled slightly in his hand. I remember her clearer than I remember your mother's exact words, if I'm honest. Young, nervous, kept looking at the door like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. Why would a witness be nervous? That's what I've wondered for 19 years. He found the entry and turned the book toward me. Witness 2. Renata, and then a last name so faded the ink had given up entirely. She wasn't family. Wasn't a friend of your mother's, near as I could tell. Your mother brought her in like she'd found her on the sidewalk. Practically had to coach her through signing her own name. Do you have an address? A phone number? I have this. He handed me a single index card, the kind he'd apparently used for intake before anyone trusted computers. Renata Okafor, it read, and beneath that, an address that no longer existed. The block had been razed for a strip mall in 2019. I'd find out later that week. No phone number. No forwarding trail. One more thing, Walter said as I was tucking the card into my bag. Your mother didn't just bring a stranger in to witness her will for no reason. People do that when they don't want anyone in their own life to know what the will says. She was protecting that document from someone specific, Dana. I always assumed it was your father, but your father's been dead longer than the will has existed. I drove home with the window cracked, turning that sentence over, protecting it from someone specific, and wondering who, in a family this small, would have needed protecting from. It took me 4 days and one very awkward conversation with the county clerk's office to find Renata Okafor's current name. She'd married. She'd taken her husband's name 11 years ago on a certificate that listed her occupation, at the time, as legal assistant. Legal assistant to whom, the certificate didn't say, but the firm listed as her employer on an old business license was one I recognized immediately because it belonged to the attorney who drafted my mother's original will. Aldous Reyes, retired now, his old office a nail salon. Renata Okafor had witnessed my mother's will as a 23-year-old paralegal working for the attorney who wrote it. That at least made sense of the nerves. A junior employee pulled in to formalize a document for a client she barely knew. What didn't make sense was her married name. I sat in my car outside the nail salon that used to be Reyes's office, staring at the printout from the clerk, for a long time, before I let myself say it out loud to no one. Renata Okafor was now Renata Whitfield, my brother's wife. Derek married Danielle. That was what everyone called her, her middle name, the one she'd used since college. 6 years ago, at a courthouse ceremony none of us questioned, because Derek didn't do big gestures. I'd sat 2 rows back at that wedding. I'd toasted her. I had never once, in 6 years, heard anyone in my family say the name Renata. I didn't confront Derek. I went to her. She opened the door of the house they rented on the east side of town with a dish towel over one shoulder, and her face did something complicated when she saw me standing there with a manila folder under my arm. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition of a moment she'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. You know why I'm here, I said. Dana. Renata, I said, and watched her flinch at her own name like it belonged to somebody she'd buried. You witnessed my mother's will 19 years ago. You worked for Aldous Reyes, and somewhere between then and now you became my sister-in-law and never once mentioned it. Can we not do this on the porch? We can do it wherever you want, but we're doing it. She stepped back to let me in, and the kitchen behind her was tidy in the specific, controlled way of a house where somebody was trying very hard to keep things calm. I didn't lie to you, she said, once the door was shut. I never told you I wasn't the witness. Nobody ever asked. Derek knew. Derek doesn't know I was a witness on your mother's will. Her voice cracked slightly on doesn't, and I realized, with a cold drop, that this wasn't a story she'd rehearsed with him. It was a story she'd been keeping from him, too. He knows I worked for Reyes for 2 years out of college. He's never once asked what files I touched. Why would he? It was before we even met, so tell him now. Tell everyone now. I need you to sign an affidavit. I know what you need. She sat down hard at the kitchen table, dish towel still slung over her shoulder, forgotten. I've known what you'd need since the day your mother died, Dana. I read the obituary at work. I've had 2 weeks to call you, and I didn't. Because the second I say I was in that room, I'm not just confirming a will. I'm telling my husband I've been sitting on a secret from before we even started dating, and I'm telling him what it means about his own mother's estate. And I genuinely do not know what he does with that information. What does it mean about his mother's estate? Danielle looked at me for a long moment, weighing something, and then went to a drawer I hadn't noticed, built into the base of the kitchen island, the kind of hiding spot you'd only know about if you lived in the house, and pulled out a slim accordion folder. I kept my own copy, she said. Not because I was planning to use it, because Reyes made every witness keep one. For exactly this reason, in case the original ever got disputed. Standard practice for contested clients. And your mother was a contested client, Dana. She told Reyes, in front of me, that she didn't trust her own lockbox. That was the first thread that pulled loose the rest of the sweater. My mother hadn't distrusted a stranger, or fate, or a house fire. She'd distrusted a specific person with a key to her house. And according to Reyes's old intake notes, which Danielle had also kept, copied word for word into a legal pad 19 years ago, because that was simply how she'd been trained. My mother had said it outright, sitting across from her attorney, the year my father died. My son goes through my things when he thinks I'm asleep. I want 2 witnesses on this, and I want the second one to be someone he's never met, because I don't want him talking her out of it. Derek had been 16 that year. Not 7, like he'd told me in the kitchen. Old enough to go through drawers. Old enough for our mother to notice and be afraid, and act on it quietly enough that even her own daughter never found out until 19 years later from a stranger's doorstep envelope and a sister-in-law's secret drawer. She never told me any of that, I said. She wasn't protecting the will from strangers. Danielle closed the accordion folder gently, like it might bruise. She was protecting it from her own son. And I think whatever happened to that original after she got sick, I think it happened exactly the way she was always afraid it would. I confronted Derek 2 days later, in our mother's kitchen again, because it seemed fitting that the room where he'd lied to me first should be the room where he finally couldn't. I talked to Danielle, I said. Whatever color was in his face left it. About what? About Renata Okafor. I let the name sit there. About 19 years ago. About a lockbox key you had in your pocket at the funeral reception that you slipped back into your own jacket instead of putting with Mom's things. About being 16, not 7. The year she wrote that will. And about her telling her attorney, on record, that her son went through her drawers while she thought she was asleep. Danielle had no right. Danielle didn't take anything from you, Derek. You took something from Mom. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than it should have. When did you take the original? Was it before the stroke or after? He sat down slowly, all the gym bro posture draining out of him at once. And for a second he looked exactly like the boy in the one photo Mom kept of him at 16. Thin, unfinished, scared of something he wouldn't name. After, he said finally. She had a bad week in the hospital. They thought she wasn't coming home, and I went to get her important papers together for the discharge nurse, insurance cards, advance directive. I found the will in the lockbox, and I read it And he stopped, started again, and I panicked. I told myself I was just holding on to it until she was stable enough to talk about it with me. That's all it was supposed to be. And then she never got stable enough. No, he said, and for the first time in 2 weeks, his voice broke instead of hardened. She didn't. Where is it now, Derek? He looked at me like the question cost him something physical. I burned it, he said. The week after the funeral, I told myself it wasn't stealing if I never told anyone what it said. That if there was no will at all, nobody had to know she'd chosen you over me, and we could just split things fairly. Like a normal family, and nobody would ever have to feel the way I felt reading it. There was no getting the original back. That part of it, the part every legal drama promises will resolve into a triumphant reveal of the actual document, simply didn't exist anymore, because my brother had turned it to ash in a fire pit in our mother's backyard, alone, telling himself a story about fairness that let him sleep at night. But the presumption of revocation only holds when there's no evidence otherwise. And I had Walter Pruitt's ledger and his willingness to testify. I had a photocopy with 2 verifiable signatures. I had Renata, Danielle, willing, finally, shakily, to sign an affidavit confirming the will's contents, the date, and the fact that she'd witnessed it at the specific request of a woman who feared her own son. And I had a sworn statement from my brother himself, given not to a judge but to me, in a kitchen, admitting he'd destroyed a document he had no legal right to touch. Danielle recorded that conversation. She'd started keeping her phone in her apron pocket, recording, weeks before I ever knocked on her door. Not out of some plan to trap him, she told me later, crying, but because some instinct in her had known for months that a day like this was coming, and she hadn't wanted to be the only person who remembered it accurately. The hearing, when it finally came, wasn't the courtroom scene people picture. No dramatic gasp in the gallery. A probate judge in a plain office, reading Walter's ledger and Danielle's affidavit, and a transcript of my brother's own admission, and concluding, in about 4 unhurried sentences, that the presumption of revocation was rebutted and the terms of the photocopied will would stand. Derek didn't come. His attorney did, and made no real argument because there wasn't one left to make. I got the house. I want to be honest and say that didn't feel like winning. Danielle left Derek 11 weeks later. Not over the will, she told me, though I think the will was the crack that let her finally see the house they'd built together clearly. She still calls me sometimes, still goes by Danielle, still hasn't told most of her own family the name Renata belonged to a version of herself she buried the same year she married my brother. I don't push her on it. I understand, better than I used to, how a person can spend 2 decades protecting a document without ever quite protecting themselves. Derek and I haven't spoken since the hearing. Aunt Carol keeps asking when we're going to let this go for the family, and I've stopped explaining to her that letting go was never actually the option on the table. That my mother had already tried that once, quietly, 19 years ago, and it had cost her the one thing she was trying hardest to keep safe. I still have Walter Pruitt's index card in my wallet, the one with Renata Okafor's old address on it, the block that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know why I kept it instead of throwing it out once the hearing ended. Maybe because it's the only object left from that whole story that isn't ash, or a courthouse filing, or a name somebody had to give up. Some nights I sit in my mother's kitchen, my kitchen now, And I think about the version of her that sat across from a young stranger 19 years ago and asked her, gently, to keep a secret for longer than either of them could have guessed it would take. I don't know if she ever imagined it would end this way. I don't think anyone plans for the second witness. You just hope, if you ever need one, that she's still out there, and that she's the kind of person who keeps her own copy.